Can you hear the buzz in the air? We're at the 18th European Space Conference, organised in Brussels at the end of January by Business Bridge Europe and Logos Public Affairs. Experts, industry leaders, journalists, students, and even some astronauts are gathering in the European capital for 2 days of conferences, roundtables, and networking coffees. Everyone's dressed up. People are shaking hands, chatting, and running from one hall to another. There's a deep sense of excitement and momentum. And in fact, just minutes after the start of the event, the European Commissioner for Defence and Space, Andrius Kubilius, makes a major announcement.
Exactly last week we started very important GovSatcom operations related with Cybersecurity development. That means that all member states now can have access to sovereign satellite communication, military and government, secure and encrypted, and built in Europe and operated in Europe under European control.
If you've listened to the last episode of Euronews Tech Talks, you're probably familiar with the acronyms GovSatcom and IRIS². If you haven't, you can find episode 64 wherever you get your podcasts. But for now, all you need to know is that they represent 2 major steps forward in European space defence capabilities. But where does Europe stand when it comes to space defence? Are European infrastructures ready for a space environment that, according to experts, is becoming increasingly aggressive? Welcome to Euronews Tech Talks, the podcast that explores the digital, technological, and scientific landscape shaping Europe. I'm your host, James Thomas. After talking about the role of satellites in space defence and trying to understand how to track spy satellites from Earth, we finally get to the Q&A episode. Today we'll be putting your questions to 2 experts. First, we'll speak with Giulia Pavesi, lead of the Security and Defence portfolio at the European Space Policy Institute, about the state of Europe's space defence system. Then we'll talk with Jean Luc Trullemans, head of the European Space Security and Education Centre at the European Space Agency, about European space cybersecurity infrastructure. As you'll hear, some questions were collected at the European Space Conference and others online. Thanks to everyone who reached out. We hope you're listening to us. And now, as always, make yourself comfortable, grab a cup of tea, and let's begin. We'd like to start this Q&A episode with a broad but rather interesting question we were sent online. One person asked us, over the past few years, how have geopolitical events reshaped Europe's plans for space defence? Here's Giulia Pavesi's answer.
Regional and international crises such as Russia's invasions of Ukraine, as well as the perceived erosion of the United States as a reliable defense partners, have compelled Europe to overhaul its space and defense planning. This perception has been reinforced also by recent US and Israeli operations in Iran, conducted in fact without informing or involving allies, despite the serious implications for regional stability and peace and for the security of European citizens in the area. In space, Europe has shifted towards treating space as a core operational domain rather than merely a supporting asset, increasingly interlinking space, defense, and industry, and has really started to pursue freedom to act and operate with a greater scope and autonomy from US authority and defense industrial interests, with the understanding that satellite navigation, secure communication, and imagery are critical pillars that underpin not only national and European military power, but also really the very European societal survival.
Space is becoming a core component of Europe's defence strategy. And Europe is trying to become more autonomous in space, creating its own independent programs and infrastructures. The secure satellite communication system, GovSatcom, and the satellite constellation IRIS² are just 2 examples of the projects Europe is pursuing to increase its autonomy. But the journey to European sovereignty in space, as Pavesi reminds us, is not an easy one, and it requires close attention to the continent's space industry.
Autonomy is not a binary switch on or off mechanism, but in this sense, also in Europe, a spectrum of different degrees of freedom and dependency. At this specific stage, Europe cannot be operational and can have an operational or a political autonomy without industrial autonomy. Despite the defense momentum, we saw a stellar, let's say, increase in defense spending. Such increased defense spending does not necessarily result in strategic autonomy nor in European sovereignty. For instance, if I heavily use new defense funding to pursue short-term defense needs, there could still be the risk to increase dependence in non-European supply chains. The moment of increased defense expenditures, therefore, is not a caution and should not be seen as a caution to react to geopolitical events, but really a catalyst in this sense to reimagine how to transform Europe's space industry, including in relation to the defense objectives pursued at European level.
A second question shared with us is, what do you see as the key space domains in which Europe is seeking greater strategic autonomy? And where is it seeing this autonomy, we add?
Key domains include, for sure, now sovereign launch capabilities, advanced Earth observation beyond civilian programs, resilient PNT, secure space-based connectivity, space domain awareness, and responsive space solutions.
The acronym PNT, just mentioned by Pavesi, refers to positioning, navigation, and timing. 3 important components that ensure satellites and space operations remain accurate and reliable under threatening conditions. But let's now look at the domains she mentioned one by one.
Launch capabilities are really a top priority to ensure independent and resilient access to orbit. In this sense, when we see a number of comparisons with the US and China in terms of launch cadence, actually those are quite sterile and of limited relevance. Because right now, and at least in this very moment, Europe's objectives differ fundamentally. Here, right now, the key issue is not frequency, but at least capability. So the capacity of Europe to be able to launch whenever it needs to, in line with its own strategic, security, or operational needs. Beyond, of course, launchers with different capacity, other elements of the launch supply chain must also be secured.
It might seem obvious, but to put anything in space, we need launch vehicles, spaceports, industries to manufacture their components, and vessels capable of transporting those components to the launch sites. It's no easy task.
We then have Earth observation. Also, Earth observation has to expand, let's say, beyond the Copernicus program component. In this sense, the announcement of the Earth observation governmental service, the EOGS initiative for the next MFF, signals an institutional recognition that the existing frameworks built around the Copernicus program component may no longer be sufficient to address the emerging security demands. However, the fact that the EOGS is linked to the next budget cycle, of course, introduces a structural delay at the time when, of course, the geopolitical pressures are accelerating.
Copernicus is the Earth observation component of the European Union's space program, mainly designed to support civilian services such as environmental monitoring. EOGS stands for Earth Observation Governmental Service and is an initiative to provide governments with high-resolution images for security and defense purposes.
We then have PNT. Despite Galileo reaching now full operational capability now since few years, the procurement and deployment delays still persist, with many member states not having yet fully equipped their military forces, their armed forces, with PNT terminals integrating PRS. Also, the penetration in this case and the scalability of PRS receivers remain limited. And also at the level of exercises in which we rely on autonomous PNT capabilities, we should systematically address the PRS service, including within defensive frameworks, beyond the over-reliance on GPS.
Galileo is Europe's own global navigation satellite system, basically the European version of the GPS. And PRS stands for Public Regulated Service and is an encrypted navigation service designed for government-authorized users.
For secure connectivity, IRIS² anchors this domain. It complements and also it supersedes progressively GovSatcom component by providing dedicated sovereign infrastructure also to deliver secure governmental satellite communication services and also overcoming, let's say, the traditional model of pooling and sharing where national satellite capacities were federated via the EU hub for shared access, reducing single nation vulnerabilities.
So yes, there are projects and programs in which Europe is investing to gain autonomy in the space defense system. But as one of you asked on social media, is Europe moving towards joint space defense capabilities or national ones?
This is an interesting question because we mentioned before that countries are developing programs at national level. Europe is developing European programs, so a bit how these coordinate, how actually states work together. And I think in this sense, Europe is gravitating toward what could really be called a federated model for space defense capabilities, which blends national sovereignty with pooling and sharing models, with interoperability by design, but also with bilateral or minilateral cooperation, rather than a binary choice between separate national defense capabilities.
According to Pavesi, European countries are developing their national space capabilities and infrastructures. However, the European space defense landscape is evolving into what she describes as a federated model, featuring partnerships, capability exchanges, and overall greater coordination.
So it's really a multi-step approach, which have to really keep in mind, in the end, the element of European autonomy. The debate is not about creating new programs, entirely new programs, although in some cases, of course, this is needed, but is really about accelerating coordination, reducing fragmentation, if not necessary, duplication sometimes ensures and redundancy ensures resilience, but also aligning the political ambition with the operational timelines.
European space defense is on everyone's lips, from scientists to politicians and business leaders. But as we learned from episode 65 of Euronews Tech Talks, the space environment can hardly be considered calm and peaceful at the moment. Anti-satellite weapons, space debris, and constellations of telecommunication satellites are all factors contributing to making space an increasingly complex domain. For these reasons, some of you asked us online about the biggest space-related challenges Europe is vulnerable to today.
We are facing a space environment that is increasingly contested, congested, and competitive.
You're listening to Jean Luc Trullemans, head of the European Space Security and Education Centre at the European Space Agency.
The main vulnerabilities can be grouped in 4 categories. The first one is the growing dependence on space services or space data-related services. I'm thinking about the European economies that is relying heavily on satellites for navigation. This is Galileo, on communication, Earth observation, financial and energy networks, synchronization or coordination, and crisis management. While you are driving your car, you'll probably see that you have a security alert button on the ceiling of your car. This is Galileo tool that will work automatically when your airbag's gonna blow up. If you have a crash that your airbags are working, automatically this will connect you to a rescue team that will connect with you and asking if you need support, if you need ambulance, you need fire department or police. So those elements, first of all, show that we are connected, but that those tools are able to save your life. That's one thing. The second thing is the cyber threats. All the systems that we are operating, all the activities that we are doing within ESA is relying on IT. The surface of attack is that large that you need to consider cyber from the very beginning. And that's why we are talking about security by design. That's the second thing. The third thing is the technological dependencies. Despite the progress towards the strategic autonomy, some dependencies remain in components. Launch services, digital platforms, or commercial services. Supply chain security is therefore a major concern. And finally, the fourth point is the safety of the orbital environment. Congestion and this allows me to come back to my introduction. In certain orbits, the proliferation of space objects and collision risks represent a structural threat that we have to take care. And I would like to point what ESA did. We launched the zero debris, which is more than a policy. It's really, and more than a statement, it's really a way to behave in space. It's even more than a declaration. All what we sent need to come back on Earth.
The ESA's Zero Debris approach is an initiative aimed at significantly limiting the generation of debris in Earth and lunar orbits by 2030. Still on the topic of space, a similar question came from Andrea, an Italian student in cybersecurity who we met at the European Space Conference.
So what do you consider the most significant cyber risk for the space sector today? Loss of service, loss of control, data manipulation?
You have to consider all the risks together if you want to build at least state-of-the-art defense. The first example, the jamming. Jamming is very common. It's the loss of service. Often the most immediate scenario through denial of service, jamming or operational disruption. Why I say it's very common is that if you look at the activities from the civil aviation, you have daily reports of services of GNSS, I mean radio navigation. This is happening daily. The other example I want to give is the spoofing. That's a bit more elaborated than jamming. Jamming is just a deny. Spoofing is a corruption of data. Corruption of data is very tricky. I just want to take the example back again of civil aviation. When you have the automatic pilot, he is bringing the plane up to the field. If you just corrupt the data and that you let things to the plane that is flying, let's say 50 feet above the ground, you can easily imagine what's going to happen. He's going to crash. And that's the risk of spoofing. Now, that's not that common loss of control. This means it's really less frequent, but potentially more severe because you're going to face orbital drift, desactivation, and even malicious use. You can use, if you take the control of a satellite, then you can use it as a kinetic weapon, throwing it to another satellite or doing stuff like that. And finally, the last point that I want to highlight is what within security and defense community we call high-level target. This means that you touch the target, but you're going to have in the meantime side effects. And an example was the attack on KSAT services. The initial target was to cut off the link between a local administration and a central administration of Ukraine. But by performing this attack, in the meantime, more than 4,000 German wind turbines were disconnected from the German power grid. And in the meantime, more than 10,000 internet stations from a French internet provider were disconnected too. So you see by this example that the side effects can be even harder than the initial target you had.
If you listen to episode 64, this last example probably rings a bell. The attack on KSAT was carried out just moments before the start of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, affecting many actors across Europe and demonstrating that cybersecurity must be a cornerstone of space infrastructure. On the relationship between the ESA and cyber threats, Andrea shared another question with us.
The ESA the science is based on openness and international cooperation. Where do you see the main risk boundary between being open and unintentionally increasing exposure to cyber threat?
Openness and international cooperation remains fundamental. It's even in our DNA. And that's the reason you have a science directorate within ESA. And they are essential for innovation, trust, and scientific progress. The issue is not to reduce the openness, but it's to better manage the associated risk. By this, I mean to better protect yourself, to better defend yourself. The boundaries generally lies along three lines that I identify. The first one is the protection of the operational system. Scientific data may be open. That's not the issue. But you need control system, you need detailed architecture, and these need to be protected and in the correct way. The other point is that differentiated information management is important. So you make a kind of repository of what you can share and what you may not share, what you need to protect, what does not need to be protected. But anyway, something that is very important and that from the very beginning of my career within ESA, I fight for is that data is part of your patrimonium. Data, and even if it's shared and free between packets, this need to be protected because it's part of you. It's part of the investment of our member states. And finally, I come back on the security by design. Openness can only be sustainable if it's supported by high and shared cybersecurity standards.
According to Jean Luc Trullemans, the ESA's scientific openness and cooperation are not to be considered a threat per se to cybersecurity standards. But Andrea, as a diligent cybersecurity student, has another question on this point.
As European mission increasingly rely on private European company, what cybersecurity risk arise from data transfer outside the European Union or from the disclosure of sensitive operation information, and how this risk can affect European security and the safety of people?
The growing involvement of European commercial actors, from my point of view, is very positive. But this introduces new challenges if you look at this through the security prism. Data transfers outside the EU, I mean by this data flows, cloud services or external providers, may expose sensitive information. Within sensitive information, you have also all the saga of classified information and so on, which I would like not to address now. Risks includes unauthorized access, and that's the main issue. Legal dependence on non-European framework and reduced control on certain digital infrastructure. The second point, the disclosure of sensitive operational information, what I ponder is the technical or planning information, even when not classified, so could be sensitive or not, can be exploited to disrupt a mission. You can aggregate information and then it becomes more tricky. Protecting such information is therefore essential too. So we have possible response, in my mind, that can include strengthening cyber security and data sovereignty requirements within the contract already, adopting zero trust architecture and strict segmentation, developing European cloud and data processing capabilities, harmonizing standards across agencies, institutions, and industry. And the goal is really to preserve the commercial ecosystem with ensuring, and back again, a high level of security.
The commercialization of space is not only a reality, but also one of the ESA's strategic priorities to boost European entrepreneurs and industry. At the European Space Conference, the intersection between the private and public sectors was particularly prominent, with stakeholders from both sides engaged in discussions on how to accelerate Europe's space ecosystem. Another relationship that stood out during the conference was the one between civil and security purposes. For example, satellites and other space infrastructures carry out tasks not only for civilian use, but also for military applications. On this note, Alexandra, a lawyer and PhD student in space law and defense in Madrid, had a question for us.
As most space systems today serve both civilian and security purposes, how can Europe strengthen its space defense and resilience without blurring the line between civilian infrastructure and military targets or increasing the risk of escalation?
Most of the space systems are today dual use. Just consider a car. If the car is painted in green, and that you have the driver of the car that is a military guy wearing a uniform, that's a military car. But if it's you or me that is driving the car wearing a nice suit, it's civilian, depending on the use you made from the tool. The doctrine and the commands that has been published right after the start of the Ukrainian war really illustrate this topic. And it's not coming from me, it's coming from a US general that was in charge of the US Cyber Command. He says that it is really the first war where you can observe dual use linked to space assets. The redundancy and the diversification of capabilities, I mean distributed constellation, rapid reconstitution capabilities and interoperability among European systems can provide tools to decrease this pressure. Another point is that norms of responsible behavior. Of course, this supposes that we are speaking and that we are adults enough. Promoting international rules aimed at reducing dangerous action or escalation risk is something we always have to keep in mind. I'm coming from the law enforcement world. It was already key, is you have to stop the disorder and not to add disorder when you intervene. And it's the same principle. Civil security coordination things that has been built for defense can perfectly be used for civil purposes. And I'm thinking about crisis management. If you can manage a military crisis, you can probably manage a civilian one. And the opposite is true too. We have also something that we have to keep in mind is the societal resilience by ensuring that ground infrastructure can operate within a degraded mode. And that's what we are precisely studying within ESAC, so the site I'm heading in Belgium. And finally, Europe can thus strengthen to space security while remain aligned with its approach, defensive, cooperative, and grounded in international law.
That's all for today. We hope you enjoyed this Q&A episode. Thank you to those who participated, sending questions to us both online and offline. If you want to share more questions and feedback, you can find our email in this episode's description. After the last 3 episodes, we hope you see space as what it is and will always be, a domain highly influenced by the political developments on Earth. We'll meet you back here, this time in less than 2 weeks on Saturday the 28th of March with a bonus episode featuring a conversation with a NASA astronaut. Thanks for listening. I'm your host, James Thomas. This series was created by Marta Rodriguez Martinez. This episode was written and produced by Alice Carnavali. The theme music is by Leo Lebrun. Sound editing and sound mixing is by Joanne Breton. Our editor-in-chief is Niaz Samadizada. Thanks to Cecilia Koparanyan for her help during the recording at the 18th European Space Conference. If you aren't already, you can listen to this series on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Castbox, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you're enjoying the podcast, please consider leaving us a positive review and, of course, sharing it. Thanks for listening.